Hello, welcome to Tales Under the Cat Tree. My name is Dileepa Wijewardena, better known as Dupes. In this podcast, we will explore the wonderful worlds created by the power of words, from life and technology to fiction and the future, through articles, stories, interviews, and more. If you like this episode, please take the time to subscribe to this podcast, as I would like to get to know you better. You can visit me at tales.dupes.ca for more. No Trial for Papa by Erwin J. Warkentin. I could hear the scratching of the soles of my father's shoes as he stood outside the door. He would always lean against the door with one hand and hold on to the porch lamp with the other. This décrotoir was oddly ornate considering its humble task, removing the mud and manure of a day's work on the farm and leaving it by the door to be washed away by the next rain. "Is dinner ready yet?" This was always the first thing that Papa said as he walked into the kitchen. Papa never walked like other people. He strode. He was a proud man. I suppose that was why he walked in the way he did. Or since he was the village's veterinarian, it could be that he'd spent too much time around animals that relieved themselves as they wished. He also always paused in the doorway before he said anything. That was one habit that I never quite understood. Why not just walk in? No. Every night it was the same thing. He would pause for a moment, as if to survey his domain, and then proceed to his place at the head of the table, asking about dinner. "Just sit, it'll be on the table in a minute," my mother would say. This was also a ritual that repeated itself every night. Everything was so mechanical at this time of the day. There were times when I imagined that I had stage-side seats to a play that had been performed once too often. There seemed to be no emotion left in their voices, a result of knowing what the answer to any given sequence of words would be. Papa eventually took his place at the table, and only then did he pay any attention to us. Then, and only then, did a smile come to his face. It was a smile that covered the whole of his face. It radiated the hidden love that he felt for us. He would parse each of our faces in turn, lingering as if it would be the last time. There we sat in silence. Only the bustling of my mother over the stove with her pots and pans could be heard. "Well, Hans, what did you do today? Stayed out of your mother's hair, I hope," my father said. All I could do at this point was shake my head yes, as I looked for approval in his eyes. He was such a big, imposing man. It was not that I feared him in any way, although my backside could attest to him being a disciplinarian. It was just that I was so small, which brought with it a certain shy awe of one so big. "Well, is no one going to eat?" my mother scolded. I had been lost in my own world. Mama had set the table and no one had noticed. Papa quietly bowed his head and folded his hands as he did at every evening meal. We all followed his silent example. He began to pray. "Dear Father, we thank you for the food that we are about to receive. Bless it to our bodies that it may give us strength." There was never any deviation. Always the same words. Still, his voice never lacked sincerity. It was as if he had discovered a great truth and was trying to impress its importance on us. "Hans, are you dreaming again?" Papa had caught me in the act, yet again. "If you don't come down to earth and spend some time with the rest of us, your supper is going to get cold." The embarrassment must have been clearly visible on my face because he started in with his booming laugh. Deep within myself, I begged for him to stop. His laugh was the worst punishment that he ever made me suffer. At that moment, I sincerely wished that I had the power to vanish and reappear when his mirth had subsided. Then, as suddenly as he had begun to laugh, he reached out with his big, loving hand and caressed the side of my face, as if wanting to wash away the redness that had taken over my usual pale complexion. "Boy," he said, "when I was your age, I was a dreamer too." He then paused, as if searching for words. "Dream on, Hans. It's the only thing that keeps me going." Again, the kitchen was silent. The clatter of cutlery against the plates was the only sound that reached out and kept me in touch with the reality of the moment. My parents chatted about the trivialities of the day. My sisters argued, as was usually the case with them. Then there was me. I sat at the table looking over my plate, observing the world as it passed by, constantly watching the man I loved so dearly. Again, I was lost in a world of my own creation. My mother began to clear the table. "Papa, when will you take me to the city with you? You did promise that you would take me. My tone could be best described as imploring. The world of the village held nothing new for me. Like most other boys, I had investigated every nook and cranny. My senses were prepared for something new. My mind craved new challenges. Papa breathed a sigh and answered, "Why are you so anxious to leave this bit of quiet? The world out there is cruel. Why would you want to lose your innocence so early in life?" The words that he spoke to me were meaningless. After all, what does a young boy know about innocence or the cruelty of the world? It seemed that he was giving me something to hold on to for some future time when all of what he said would be made clear to me. "But, Papa, you promise me." Once more, I was imploring him to show me the things I had only heard about. "Hans, when I make a promise, I keep it. Next time I go, I'll think about taking you along. I don't know when that will be. I'm not even sure if I'll be allowed to go, myself." His answer seemed strange. Why was he so unsure of himself suddenly? It was not at all like him. As I drifted away once more, I became oblivious to all that was around me. Suddenly, my bliss was interrupted by a sharp rap at the door. "Open the door right now, or we'll break it down," came the shout from outside. Before Papa could move, the door exploded into the room with such violence that it flew off its hinges. "David Classen, you are under arrest. Come with us," a voice said with authority. Two large men stood menacingly over my papa. What did they want with him? I had heard of this happening to the fathers of some of the other boys, but not my papa. "What's the charge?" my father asked quietly. Mama had lost all her color in her face and stood as if paralyzed. My sister had run out of the kitchen into the front room. I could hear them whimpering. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My papa had given up. His voice had betrayed that much to me. The two burly men had already grabbed my papa's arms and hauled him out of his chair. I sprang to my feet to save him, but my mother grabbed me and tore me to her breast. She held me so tight that I could hardly breathe. She buried her face in my hair, which was soon wet with her tears, trying to conceal her terror. 2 shots rang out. I not only heard them, but felt them as a shudder ran through my mother's body. Then it was quiet. No sound could be heard, except the disappearing tramping of feet, and a truck starting, then rattling off into the night. So you just heard me read out a story called No Trial for Papa by Dr. Erwin J. Warkentin, who is here with me today. And welcome back to Tales Under the Cat Tree, Erwin.
Well, you know that I always enjoy talking to you. This is just a little bit of a different forum.
It's the second show, so part number 2 of Erwin and Dups Do a podcast. Erwin, that was a very hard read for me. It's quite an emotional story from start to finish. I first want to ask you the very simple question: is this fact or is this fiction?
In German, you would say nein. That is a combination of yes and no. In other words, yes, there's a lot of truth to it. It's based on truth, but it's fictional in the sense that it's a very generic story, that it's made up of different bits and pieces. And then, of course, my own imagination filling in blanks. So, yes, it's true, and no, it isn't.
You and I, of course, had a chat about this story before I read it out. So I have a picture that you gave me that I have published with the story on tales.dupes.ca, so you can go have a look at it. This picture revolves around the people about whom part of the story is about.
On the left, there's a young boy. He's about 8 years old. That's my father. This is 1929 or so. And next to him, that's his sister. And the lady in the middle, that's my grandmother. At this point, she's all of about 32, and she looks considerably older than 32. And then, of course, next to her is my grandfather. These are the people about whom the story is about. They're the characters in the story. Their name, of course, is Warkentin and not Klassen, as I indicated in the story. And so this is a little bit of that alienating effect that's taking place for me, where I'm taking some distance from it. It takes place in the Ukraine at the time of the Soviet Union. They are the drivers behind this story, and for me, each of them kind of holds a very special place.
So in the story, then, if I'm understanding it correctly, the young boy is your father. The mother is, of course, your grandmother, and David Klassen, who gets shot, is your grandfather.
Exactly.
First of all, what is the year that you've set this story in? So when did this happen?
Okay. This story actually takes place in 1937. So the people in the story that in the picture are actually a lot older. My father is about 16 at this point. His sister is about 14. And then, of course, my grandfather and my grandmother are older as well. This was the time of the great purges in the Soviet Union. Stalin decided it was a good idea to kind of get rid of all of the what he called the kulaks. You know, these people, these undesirables, people that he considered to be parasites on society. And oddly enough, in this part of the Soviet Union, it was mostly the Germans and particularly the Mennonites that made up this class of people that he wanted to get rid of. Essentially, he wanted to take all of their stuff, he wanted to take their land from them, which they had already effectively done, but he needed them out of the way. And so that's kind of the historical background of what was going on at the time. Now, specific to this, my grandfather and my grandmother and my father were actually taken prisoner in 1937. They were grabbed by the local powers that be. And my grandfather, I found recently, was executed on October 31st, 1937. The Soviets were actually very efficient. It was just a single bullet to the back of the head. And so there were thousands upon thousands of people that died in this way. My father, for the longest time, assumed that he had died of starvation. He had been sent to Siberia. That was the typical story. Oh, he disappeared to Siberia. That didn't happen. He was killed before he actually had the opportunity to die in Siberia. My father was saved by his age. He didn't like left wing politics at all, and that's really putting it mildly. But he did say there was one communist in there that came into the prison where that they were being held, took one look at him and as his documentation, and said, he's not of age of majority. He's not old enough. He's not 17. It was 17 at that time in the Soviet Union. So he has to go home. And since he's not of the age of majority, his mother has to accompany him home. And so they were sent back to their village. In the meantime, his brother and two sisters had been put into an orphanage. They then had to go and collect them and try to put the family back together. So he then survived that part of what was really a horrible beginning to life. It was not a pleasant time to be alive.
Not for many people. And then from there, somehow your family managed to make it to Canada and to Manitoba.
My father did. My grandmother was eventually, she had actually made it as far as Berlin in 1944. And then she was grabbed by the Russians once they took over Berlin. And they sent her to Kazakhstan along with her other three children. My father had been in the German army and he had been taken prisoner at, at the end of hostilities. And so he was safe, as it were. Although the Russians did come for him too, there was an American officer. Again, there's this strange thing about kindness of strangers along the way, who told him that they were coming for him and that he should, under no circumstances, leave his barracks on a particular day, no matter what. And so he didn't. This American officer simply told the Russians that this guy had been a problem since day one and they'd eventually shot him. And his body had kind of gone down the river. You know, he was trying to escape or some story like that. And I always kind of took that with a grain of salt, my father's story, until I met the American who came and visited him. This was years and years and years later. I was already married at this point, and it turned out the whole story was true. So there's this whole idea of sometimes truth can be fiction and sometimes fiction can be truth, and we simply don't know.
Well, I think this then comes to the very important question that I have for you, which is, why did you not write the absolute truth here? And why did you make it into a story with some truth and some fiction?
Honestly, my first thought was to spare myself. It's an incredibly emotional story for me because of who's involved with it. If you think of it, that night in many respects determined who my father was going to be, for the rest of time, for his time anyway, and what kind of a father he was going to be to me and all the rest of it. It also determined that I would essentially grow up without a grandparent. My grandmother did live until 1964, and I do have letters and postcards from her, but that's it. And some pictures. And so for me, it was to kind of step back from it, but also make it relatable to other people. This was not an isolated incident. This repeated itself over a period of 2 years or so in countless different homes. In each and every case, it was a little bit different. And so, what I wanted to do was borrow from these other stories so that others could kind of latch onto a part of the story and say, this is part of who I am, or I can relate to this because. And so it becomes an amalgam of truths that in and of themselves are fiction once they're all put together.
And why do you think this kind of story is important today?
It's a warning in some respects of things that can happen if you allow authoritarian type governments and people to have too much power in the world. It also passes my story on, hopefully, to another generation so that they know who I am, but even more importantly, that they know who my father was and who my grandparents were and my aunt, the young girl in the picture. I mean, they don't figure prominently in the story, but that's, by design. It's important for the reason of keeping their memories alive and allowing for some sort of emotional connection between the present and the past. In some ways, saying, well, we aren't that different. Sometimes people of today consider themselves perhaps a little superior to the people of the past because we know so much more. Well, and the thing is, this notion of my grandfather reaching out and kind of comforting my father. That's something that we would expect today, but somehow we have this notion of the fathers and grandfathers of previous generations being so stoic and distant that they didn't do this. The fathers have always done this, and they will always continue to do this. So it's those sorts of things, to kind of break down some of these historical stereotypes that we might have.
This goes back to the idea of the role of creative writing. And for me, one of the problems that I have is when we write anything about history, we tend to put what is happening today into the past, even though we have absolutely no idea how the past was, because we really weren't alive then. And a lot of things actually were different then. A lot of expressions were different then. Even the way that they did treat children was different then. How does this fit? Like in terms of trying to reconcile the two things. One, the past was very different, but it is at the same time very similar.
What we want to do is we want to also recognize and know these people as human beings. I think that's part of it. So we try to modernize them, and in some ways, that's what we're doing with historical fiction today. I mean, it's all the rage. Every which way you look, there's historical fiction going on, and that's because we're trying to fill in these blanks and make this thing perhaps a little more real for ourselves. But don't think we can get away from the notion of we can create distance from our present situation by looking at the past. And this is something that goes back to someone like Friedrich Schiller, the German author. And he wrote quite a few theoretical works about literature. And one of them was that a work of literature is essentially, and he didn't have the language for it at the time, but a simulation that you run. And okay, what if the person said this? What would happen? And he wrote a lot of historical fiction. And for him, it was always this experiment. What if they did this slightly differently? What would the outcome be? And so, to some degree, when we do this, we're looking at these other possibilities and possibilities perhaps missed in our past.
That's a very good way of putting it. And the human mind, I mean, this is what stories are: simulations of ideas, of thoughts, of things that we want to do, that we wish we could have done. that make us want to do something, desire, hate, everything.
Yeah, and the funny thing is that I can't even take credit for that. I have to give credit to a man from 225 years ago who was doing exactly the same thing then that we're doing now.
You've told me that there's an aftermath to this that is quite interesting and fascinating because your grandfather was designated as a German spy, and that's why he was executed.
Well, after the fact, well, he was considered a German spy for many, many years until about 1986. He eventually was given not a pardon, but he was declared rehabilitated. And that's kind of the official term that was used in the USSR. My father made a number of trips to Germany, and I was always a little curious as to what he was doing there because he seemed to be meeting with different people that I knew nothing about. Normally, I would have helped him with this, but somehow he had been in communication with the Russian government at the time. Well, it still would have been the USSR. And then eventually in 86, somewhere 86 to 88, the document indicate that Gorbachev actually rehabilitated him. That is my grandfather. In other words, he didn't do it. He wasn't a spy.
Having gone through this story and having had this discussion, for anyone who's reading this today, listening to this podcast, listening to the story, what's the biggest takeaway?
The biggest takeaway is that you have to cherish and appreciate every moment that you have with those people around you because you don't know when you're not going to have any more moments.
And I think with that, we will say thank you very much to Dr. Warkentin for coming on the show and talking about No Trial for Papa.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I was going to say I enjoyed this. It's hard, but I did enjoy this.
Owen, you're going to be back again, right? We're going to do another couple of episodes on different subjects.
Exactly. And I think at some point I get to turn the tables.
Yes, you will. But that's to be coming up in the future. Again, thank you very much, Dr. Warkentin. We will see you next time on Tales Under the Cat Tree. Thank you for listening to episode 15 of Tales Under the Cat Tree. Can you believe that we've managed to do 15 episodes? I can't. We've covered everything from AI and vibe coding to today's episode on the Soviet purges. But we aren't stopping here, and I will be back next week. This week, I would like to thank you, every person who has listened or read the articles and taken a moment to comment in public or private. It brings a smile to my face. In a world being covered by AI-generated content, I'm happy to continue to provide something original and entertaining. So thank you. If you believe that this podcast or the writing I feature deserves to be seen by others, please do share. It would mean a lot to me and to the many friends who help me, listen to me, and will come on the show in the future. You can reach me through email, contact@dupes.ca, bluesky@dups.ca, or on my site and this post at tales.dupes.ca. The intro music is composed by me. Remember to subscribe so I can get to know you better and learn from you. Give your pet a cuddle and your loved ones a hug till we meet again for some Tales Under the Cat Tree.